So, I would consider camping my passion. It's the only hobby I have that I take so much interest in and get really excited to do. More specifically, camping alone. Of course, I camp with friends every once in a while, but nothing really matches the experience of camping in the wild alone. Something about sitting by a fire you made yourself until late and going to bed with nothing but the sound of the wild to accompany you. Of course, camping alone also means I experience some pretty scary stuff. Usually, it's just animals, howls and cries from the woods that send chills down your spine, or animals that take an interest in your tent. I've had bears sniff and bat at my tent, which is absolutely terrifying and usually keeps me up the rest of the night. I make sure I don't keep any food in my tent though, so no animals should ever really want to get in my tent. The scariest thing to encounter out in the wild, however, is another person. You would think that animal and human footsteps sound relatively similar, but they don't. I've only had it happen twice until now. The first time, it was just passing footsteps in the grass. They didn't do anything, but still, it scared me. The second time, someone stopped and waited for a while. They sounded about 20 feet from my tent. I was holding my breath until they just walked off. However, about a month ago, I had my scariest camping experience. It was probably around 2 a.m. and I had been lying in my sleeping bag for about an hour, just listening to the sounds of the wild, when I heard footsteps approaching. I remember how they sounded as they brushed through the grass. They kept getting closer and closer, and at this point, I was pretty freaked out. It sounded like they were directly approaching my tent, and that they were. They stopped right in front of the entrance of my tent. I was trying my hardest to keep my breathing quiet. I always take a handgun with me when I go camping, just to be safe from animals. That was the first thing to come to my mind when they stopped in front of my tent. I, as quietly as I could, reached into my open backpack, feeling around softly through the clothing and such. I finally found the gun and pulled it out carefully. I held it tightly, staring at my tent door. What happened next really made me panic. The person outside my tent started to unzip my tent door. It was slow, like they were trying to be quiet. At this point, I was thinking, no more making assumptions. You need to make sure you don't get murdered. So I flipped the safety off my gun. The person stopped unzipping my tent door after that click. I choked out the words, "Who's there? I have a gun." After that, the person ran off faster than I had ever heard anyone run. I couldn't shut my eyes after that. I was shaking. I thought for sure I was either going to be killed or kill someone that night. I still go camping alone. The scariness is honestly the best part about it. Never know what you're going to encounter. With the recent influx of woodland/nature related stories, I figured I'd finally share something that I've been sort of trying to forget for years. I've never told anyone about it, including the individuals involved, because I've always been a skeptic myself, And how can I expect someone to believe my stories when I always hear theirs with a critical ear? Nonetheless, everyone here seems receptive, and if anyone has had a similar experience or can help me explain what happened, I'd love to hear it. 2 days after graduating high school, my two best friends and I decided to take a camping trip on a mountain frequented by the locals. Although it's by no means in the middle of nowhere, the town it is located in is a bit smaller and by no means a bustling metropolis. My friends, Brian and Greg, were 2 years older than me and had taken the trip to celebrate their graduation, and figured they'd introduce me to my college-age years by doing the same thing. We packed up all the necessities: tent, chairs, horrible light beer, the whole 9 yards. It was nearing dusk when we began hiking up to the camping area, which was about 4 or so miles from the base of the mountain. We set up camp and chatted away, giddily exchanging drunken anecdotes while snacking on the burnt hot dogs that we attempted to cook on the on-site fire pit, and eventually passed out at about 2 a.m. Not long after nodding off, a noise snapped me out of sleep. I was pretty intoxicated, but I could make out what sounded like music coming from outside the tent. I assumed it was Greg or Brian's phone going off and tried to ignore the sound, rolling over. It was at this point I realized that I no longer had my blanket or pillow in the tent with me, and upon opening my eyes, I realized that this was not in fact the tent that we had set up at all, but a tarp which had been fashioned into a makeshift lean-to. My buzz was instantly replaced with full-blown panic as I broke into a cold sweat. I peered out of the lean-to and saw what the actual cause of the music was. A cassette player was sitting in the grass about 10 feet away from the tarp and was playing what sounded like a homemade recording of a little girl singing that church song, "Go Tell It on the Mountain," accompanied by what I guessed was an offbeat xylophone. The only other defining feature at this campsite was a clothesline, one end affixed to a tree, the other to the ground. There were 3 white dresses hanging from it, swaying slightly in the breeze. The whole thing was unsettling as hell, to say the least. I was still trying to make sense of what was going on when I heard walking in the forest about 50 yards away. I froze, not wanting to believe what I was experiencing, hoping that when I opened my eyes, I'd be back at the tent. No such luck. The rustling slowly got closer and closer. The tape abruptly clicked as it came to an end, and the rustling became what sounded like a full-blown sprint. I tore off down the mountain, stumbling a few times and ripping open my knee on the gravelly trail. I didn't even realize it or feel the pain until the next day. I was so full of adrenaline. I don't know how the hell I managed to make it back to the base of the mountain where we'd parked. I locked myself in my car and waited until morning. I guess I managed to fall back asleep because I was woken to Greg tapping on my driver's side window. He and Brian gave me some grief about how I was such a pussy for not being able to stick it out the whole night on the mountain. I let them rag on me because I figured it would be easier than trying to explain the truth to them, and I didn't quite want to revisit it myself. It wasn't until a couple weeks later that I dared to ask a question that had been nagging on me. I couldn't help but wonder how they'd figured out that I'd gone back to my car. I asked Brian when we were hanging out playing video games a couple nights later, and he told me that they'd got my note, and then just assumed I'd gotten scared and went back to the car. I asked him what note he was referring to, as I definitely had no recollection of leaving one. He swore I did, and claimed that he still had it in his camping bag. After rummaging around a few minutes, he produced a scrap of paper that simply said, "Out walking." I slowly nodded and said that I guess I must have sleep wrote it. He laughed as he crumbled it up and tossed it towards the garbage can. It's been 3 years since that night, and I can't explain the events of that camping trip. But I do know one thing. That note wasn't in my handwriting. Several years ago, I went on a camping trip out in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. I'm a native and had never been there, so when my buddy Alan from college found out, he coaxed me into driving for him. I had a big truck with a canopy. Alan had all the camping gear, so we were set for a full-on excursion in the wild. My dog, Max, wasn't going to be okay by himself in my apartment for 5 days, so I figured he could come with us. He was an 8-year-old German Shepherd mix, with one blue eye and one brown, with an insatiable love for outdoor walks. Overall, we were inseparable. Day 1. So, we left my place in Bremerton and drove the 4 hours to Sequim, where Alan knew a good campground just inside the woods, about 10 miles. It was a main thoroughfare, but still off the path enough to give us the woodsy feeling we were looking for. Since we left way too late in the day, it was almost dark when we got to the site. Alan figured that there would be no way to set up a tent, so we just decided to sleep in the truck bed instead. The canopy I had was sturdy, and it wasn't too cold outside yet, so Alan, Max and I just piled in and crashed. Well, it was about 2 a.m. when I woke up to a strange sound from outside, like an animal call of some sort, but nothing I'd ever heard before. It almost sounded like a girl screaming, but in a way that she was just pretending, like a 5-year-old would when she was playing around. It was a silly sound, really. Totally pitch black outside. I fumbled for my flashlight and worked the handle on the canopy door. As soon as I lifted the glass pane and shined the light on the ground, the wailing instantly stopped. Like whatever it was saw me coming and shut up real fast. Then I felt something shake the truck. So hard, in fact, that I almost fell out the back onto my head. It even woke up Alan and Max. Alan woke in a flurry of hands and feet and was up with his rifle in a minute. But the strange thing was that Max didn't bark. He only whined and whimpered, and he refused to move from my side, fixed on whatever was out there in the dark. Alan got out his light and shined it around the area where we were parked, but didn't see anything. All the while, Max continued to cry. I sat in the bed of my rig with my dog, petting him to calm him down, but he was seriously perturbed. I'd never seen him like that before, and it was a red flag for me. It seemed like an hour before Alan returned. He said he didn't see anything out there, and the truck was fine, so he just chalked it up to a deer brushing against the side of the truck. I didn't agree with him. It rocked the truck hard, and something didn't seem right to me. I don't have a lot of experience in the woods, but everyone knows that feeling you get when you start to think there could be something hidden in the inky blackness of the forest at night. A couple hours passed, and before I was asleep again, I heard another sound, but this time it seemed like it was whining. Max hadn't really calmed down, and the noise from out in the forest sounded like it was taunting my dog. It was in perfect time with Max, almost making fun of him somehow. I can't explain it any better than that. My dog would whine, then a few seconds later, I'd hear a similar sound, far off in the brush, like someone was emulating the sound of a dog crying. What really got me was how each time it called back to Max, it sounded identical. The way the pitch raised and lowered at the same time, each time. It was unsettling. Day 2. I barely slept with all the noise from Max. When I woke, it was dawn, so I immediately made camp and started a fire. Coffee is a first in the morning for me, and when Alan had finally gotten up, I had a cup ready for him. "Did you hear that sound outside from the woods last night, after you came back from checking the truck? The crying sound?" I asked him. "I didn't hear anything but your damn dog all night. He's sleeping outside tonight, that's for sure," he said. Alan wasn't in the best of spirits. I didn't like the idea, but I didn't relish another restless night, so I agreed. But I was sleeping with my camera on me. If something was going to show, I was going to get a picture of it. We hiked into the hills about 5 miles that day. Alan took the lead, and Max and I followed. This was more his thing, and I knew it, so I just let him lead us wherever he wanted. He had more experience, and I didn't feel like arguing with him. Alan was that guy at the party that directed everyone, and couldn't stand it when someone challenged him. The real leader type, hard-headed, outgoing, definitely the alpha male. That night we spent at the fire, toasting marshmallows and drinking beer. Alan's mood had lifted some, and we were getting along pretty well. Max was at my hip, hanging out quietly. The prior night's events were far in the back of my mind, thanks to the beautiful walk we had. I don't know why, but in the middle of my reflecting moment around the campfire, something urged me to ask Alan about his experiences in the forest. Namely, if he had ever witnessed something he couldn't explain rationally. This is what he told me. A few years ago, I was working for the Forest Service here in the Olympics. My jurisdiction was further in, near the coast where the forest was particularly dense and unexplored. I was on contact for a lot of the trail making there, and I led a team of guys, numbering around 20 or so, up and down the coast, constructing trails, paths, stairways and the like. We did everything from cutting trees to blasting with dynamite to make way for these roads in the woods. There are thousands of miles of trails in this forest, made by guys like me, lonely and depressed, with no families to call our own. It wasn't a job that I loved, but I was good at it, and I got to play with explosives. One time, when we were about to complete a project in the Bailey Range down in the Humes Glacier, we were hit with a snowstorm that stranded us up there for 4 days. Our biggest problem was the cold. It was 0 degrees Fahrenheit by nightfall, and I knew we wouldn't make it if we didn't get fires going and tents up. Food wasn't an issue, it was just a serious bummer after being up there for a month. All that time with beautiful weather, it seemed like something wanted us to stay. The next day, when I awoke, 10 of the 20 guys I had with me had gone missing. There were no footprints because of the heavy snowfall, and not a trace of where they had gone. They hadn't even taken their coats or shoes. It was as if they'd gotten up in the middle of the night and walked to the woods barefoot. We couldn't make heads or tails of it. A couple of guys and myself went out in the brush to look for them. The snow hadn't stopped one bit, and we could barely see 2 feet in front of our faces. Storms out there in the peninsula can get bad, with the currents blowing all kinds of mess from the Pacific. This was a full-on blizzard. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. The only 2 ways to get on the cliffside where we had camped was north and south, along the ridge. To the north led to the service road from where we came from. South was the Humes Glacier, where we had stopped the trail construction due to icy conditions. We walked up and down that damn path all day looking for any signs of life. It was completely silent the whole day, like the snow had forced all life to retreat. It was when we arrived at the glacier path that we realized that they were probably dead. On a rocky incline leading to the main glacial sheet, right at the foot of the shelf, we found an opening in the ice, a cave. The entrance was littered with the torn clothing of my missing friends, haphazardly laying everywhere. Each article was covered in blood and snow. There were jeans with wallets still inside, family photos, credit cards and cash, all left intact. My 2 buddies, Tom, who was the foreman, and his brother Will, were with me. Armed to the teeth, we went inside the dark hole, not knowing quite what we would find. Will called into the opening, "Hello?" And at first we didn't hear a sound, but after a minute, a response from the darkness. The same word returned back to us, but it didn't sound right. It was laboured and breathy between syllables, and deliberately sounded out, "Hello?" It was a deep voice, almost a growl, almost a whisper. I'm telling you, it sounded large and definitely not human. After it spoke, the whole mouth of the cave began to smell like rotten meat. We turned and ran as fast as we could out of the mouth of the glacial opening, and when we were around 100 feet or so from the entrance, we saw something come out, walking upright on 2 legs. This thing looked as if it were covered in thick hair, encrusted with mud from head to toe. It must have been 8 feet tall. I think what terrified me most was what it was holding in its hand. It was a human head, with blood still dripping from the neck. We ran back to camp and told the others. Afterward, we left and hiked the 10 miles back to the road, where we called the police and forest service. The bodies were never found, and a week later, what was left of my team and I were relocated to the Cascades. Each of us were questioned thoroughly, but we were all ruled out as suspects due to the nature of the disappearances. We never heard about it again after that, and eventually it ruined my career. He told me afterwards where we were camped was roughly 10 miles from the exact spot where that happened. So, putting two and two together, I then asked him why we were there, near the same place where this horrible event happened. Then, he told me the real reason for being out there. It had nothing to do with the trip, just for fun. This was personal for him. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth, Jake. I'm here to find the thing that killed my crew and ruined my life. I've been a laughingstock for too long, and I need evidence for my own peace of mind. Please, will you help me?" he said, reverently. Later that night, we heard the sounds again. The emulated dog cry. Only this time, Alan actually heard it too. He loaded his rifle and made his way down the trail a ways. I followed behind with my camera, just in case there was really something out there in the dark. Alan called out into the jet darkness of the woods. "Hello?" The crying sound stopped instantly and was replaced with the sound of footfalls on twigs and branches, loud, even thuds. The snapping brush noises passed us, heading back toward where we came from, by the truck. When it sounded like it was real close, I snapped a picture of the trees near me, followed by several others. As the flash on my Nikon went off, we heard the footsteps lead off, away from us, hurriedly. It had gone. Alan didn't sleep that night. Honestly, I only slept a wink myself after that. Whatever it was out there in the dark was huge and obviously intelligent. If everything Alan said was true, then it was also a dangerous predator. I decided to head home in the morning. I didn't see Alan again after that. Life has a way of getting in the way of relationships. In addition, I really didn't enjoy him lying to me about his reasons for going out to the Olympics in the first place, so I didn't have a problem with his absence from my life. I ended up moving, starting a new career in electronics, and got married. Things have been good for me. So, I bought a house in the Pacific Northwest about a year ago. Moving is fun. Sometimes you find things that you lost over the years when you go through all your stuff, trying to get it put away. Well, the other day, I found an old box that I hadn't stored in my basement. So, being the efficient one, I decided to find out what was in it. I found the film from that camping trip with Alan inside. Remembering what happened those few days in the forest, I immediately went to town and had it developed. Several of the photos were just pictures of trees and fallen logs, but one picture in particular piqued my interest. If you look near the lower right of the photograph, there is something looking back at the camera.